one specific chert type, which is Wyandotte Chert or Hornstone or Harrison County Flint. That type of material has these things that people are calling hinges, even on old authentic points. A lot of people think they're modern fakes, but they're not necessarily. They may or may not be. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, and I've pulled a few points out from my personal finds just to show, kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about. So let's get to it. Okay, first of all, I'm going to talk about what I learned in flint knapping as a hinge. And that is, it's a type of fracture when you're making a point. And there's two types of fractures, hinge and step fracture. So let's say this is your biface you're working on here that I've drawn out. Okay, and you're trying to drive a flake across the side of this blade. You want to drive it all the way across the face of it, and maybe the flake goes that far and breaks off. That is where your fracture's at. So I'm trying to drive a flake all the way across here from this side to here, but for whatever reason it goes about that far and it breaks. My flake breaks off. Okay. That is the end of your flake, and if it's 90 degrees, that would be a step fracture. If it is rounded, that would be a hinge fracture. You know, think about a set of steps. A set of steps is 90 degrees, and a hinge where the two parts come together is usually rounded. So the way I learned years ago, and all the books I read on flint knapping and all the classes I took and stuff, that was what a hinge was. It was when a flake broke off, but it didn't break off at 90 degrees. So again, 90 degrees would be a step when it breaks like a step, and then something that's not like that, that's more smooth, would be a hinge. So I'm going to demonstrate that with a couple little pieces I have here. This is a step fracture. As you can see, it's a 90-degree break, and it's caused this big stack on here. There are some step fractures on this side. See how they're 90 degrees? It's just like a cliff. It's like straight off and drops off. That is a step fracture. And if you have a number of those, it creates a stack where there's like one step fracture stacked upon another upon another. So that's what a step is. I'm going to take this piece of material. This one has a step or two on it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, yeah. Over here on this side, here's a step. I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but they've tried to drive this flake across, probably to take this ridge out, but they went that far and left a step. 90-degree terminus of the flake. Over here on the other side, though, we have a hinge fracture. This is a classic hinge. They tried to drive this flake off. Instead of breaking at 90 degrees, it kind of rounded. The shock wave kind of reverberated back and it rounded off. So it's not a 90 degree, it's not a step, it's a hinge. It's a rounded off break versus over here on this side where it's 90 degrees straight up and down where the break is. So that's what I learned was the difference between a step and a hinge. Okay, not that the terminology necessarily matters, but what these guys on the videos and that are out there now are talking about is an incompletely removed flake. So think about, and we've all done this, like if you smash your finger or you smash your toe and the nail comes completely off, it changes color, right? It's like it's white. The part that's broken off is white underneath. It's no longer, it might be attached like right on one edge, but it's basically removed from your finger. It's not, and you know it's going to hurt like crap when you when it comes off all the way because that skin under there is going to be tender. That's an incompletely removed nail when you injure yourself. Well, this is what people are referring to, I'm seeing a lot now, as hinges. Here's one on this piece of material. Right here, the shock wave has already gone through this piece of material right here. This is basically detached completely. You can see the different color because of the light getting under there. I could probably take my fingernail and push real hard and knock that flake off. It has been completely removed. It's just hanging on, maybe right on the very edge or something. Just like when you smash a toenail or something like that. That's what people are calling hinges now, a lot of them, and they're just flakes that are not completely removed. And yeah, they may end, you know, the end of this flake right here where this thing ends may be, indeed, may be a hinge fracture, but it may be a step fracture, or it may be the full length of the flake they wanted to drive off there. The flake just didn't come off. So I think calling that a hinge maybe is a little bit of a misnomer, maybe not. You know, maybe there's some other literature that contradicts that, but this is what, when you hear about guys talking about fakes and they're saying look for hinges on points, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about flakes that are not completely removed. Again, this flake has been, for all intents and purposes, removed, but it's still hanging on just barely. But this part where it's lighter underneath is no longer attached to the point underneath it. And it may end in a step, 90 degrees, or it may end in a hinge, rounded off, or it may just kind of gently slope out and be the length of the flake they wanted to remove. But anyway, that's what they're talking about, is these flakes that are not completely removed off the point. Now, why do these hinges matter? Well, you'll see this on a lot of the videos. And this is true. Whenever you see a newly made point in just about any type of material, a lot of those little pieces are not completely removed. A lot of those little flakes are still hanging on, like what we're seeing there. You know, here's some pieces on this one are hanging on. If it's a modern replica of a point, there tends to be more of them, especially depending upon the chert type. And the theory is, and there's a lot of truth to it, is that over time, you know, if you have a flake like this that didn't come all the way off, see, this is basically removed. See, lighter color, just like the broken fingernail or toenail. Lighter color, I could probably take a little metal pick and bing, that little piece would come right off there, but it's just barely hanging on. The theory is over time, with freezing and thawing, getting tumbled around in the dirt and plowing or whatever happens to the material, these pieces wear off. So if you have an authentic old prehistoric point, it's not going to have any of these fresh flake looking pieces on it because they will have all worn off over time. And there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not into authenticating points. I don't buy points. I don't sell points. I'm a hunter. I guess I'm a collector because I have a collection, but my collection is everything that I've found or my family's found or friends have given to me. I've never bought points, never will. I've never sold points, never will. So authentication is not a big deal for me. I mean, yeah, somebody could plant a fake on me or something, but otherwise it's not something I have to deal with. But if you're buying points, it's a big issue because a lot of guys are out there, you know, it's like anything. If they can screw you over and do something dishonest, it's like a badge of honor for them instead of doing things the honest way. I think it's deplorable that guys do that. Nothing wrong with napping a modern point and being good at it, but passing it off as a fake and stealing somebody's money for doing it, that's wrong. But anyway, it matters to a lot of people because of that. So one of the telltale signs is a lot of these little unremoved flakes. So the reason I'm doing this video, though, is depending on your chert type, that may or may not be a good indicator. And there's really, and I'm going to show you some specific examples in a minute in my points. But the main reason that this came up, there's a couple reasons. There's one guy that has a good channel, Outdoor Retiree. Check him out if you haven't. Seems like a really nice guy. And he found a Kirk point, a serrated Kirk point made of Wyandotte Chert that had tons of those fresh flakes on it. And it was broken out in the field, and he suspected someone might have planted it on him. You know, he wasn't trying to pass it off, obviously, as fake, and he paid an authenticator to look at it, and the authenticator would not paper it. Well, I wouldn't have papered it either because it did have enough of those fresh flakes to be suspect. However, personally, I believe it, like 90% believe that his point is probably an authentic prehistoric point and not a modern replica. But, you know, you never know. The only way you can really tell if something's fake is to have handled tens of thousands of points and to have a powerful microscope and know what you're looking at, because there's things guys can do with chemicals and aging to fake patinas and to fake age on points. Good nappers know which type of flaking techniques to use, which type of materials. It's real easy to get burned if you're buying points by a fake. So he thought, you know, he wasn't buying the point, but he thought somebody might have planted it on him. I don't think they did, but the main reason he was suspicious was because of all these fresh flake scars on there. Then I found a point. In fact, I think I have it out here. Let me see if I can find the case that it's in. I found a point and put it on a video recently. Yeah, it's this big Matanzas point right here. And someone questioned the authenticity of it as if I were planning it, and which I don't mind. That's a good question. That's what you should do. You should call things out and, you know, not let people scam you. And somebody have planted that point on me and it's a fake? Possibly. I mean, I don't think so. Looking at it, it looks mighty real to me when you look at it closely. But that is a possibility. I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but I did find that point in the field. But the reason it looks that way is because it is Wyandotte Chert, and Wyandotte Chert often, as I said, keeps these fresh looking flakes on there. So I'm just going to demonstrate that fact. You know, if I found a point or somebody gave me a point or I was buying a point and it had a lot of those flakes, I would be suspicious. So I'm not discounting those videos that say to look out for hinges, but just because there's hinges on a point does not mean it's not authentic and old. And in fact, when you're dealing with Wyandotte Chert, most points, it's actually the rule more than the exception. Almost all points will have, as I'm going to show you, some of those fresh hinges regardless of time period. But I do know that I found points in all places, like right here where we're standing, right here on my own property up on this high ground, and down in the river bottoms I have found points of Wyandotte Chert that don't have any of those fresh flakes on them, and I found points that are covered with them. And the same with everywhere I've been, all over different places. So anyway, I'm just going to show this to demonstrate that, you know, Wyandotte Chert, I'm not saying that, you know, still be careful. You know, if you see all those fresh flakes, it very well could be fake. It would be a red flag, but don't discount a point as being fake just because it has them, because that's not necessarily the case. So let's look at some examples here real quickly. And some cherts don't do that. Some of these cherts, like here's a lot of fossiliferous Harrodsburg chert. I've got tons of points of that in here, and I don't see a single one of them with a fresh looking flake on it. For whatever reason, maybe the color differentiation doesn't show, or maybe they come completely off over time more easily or more readily. But out of all these points here, you know, tons of them are this speckled fossiliferous Harrodsburg, Allen's Creek, and Haney chert, and none of those have any of those flake scars that look fresh on them. So on that type of material, yeah, if you saw one with a bunch of those fresh flake scars, I would definitely put up a red flag. It's most likely fake. But on the Wyandotte, we're talking about totally different. So here's a point I already kind of showed you. And you can see there's a lot. This is a broken piece I found this year. So, you know, somebody's not going to plant something like this out in the field and try to fool somebody, most likely. And if it was just one or two pieces, yeah, they could be plants and, you know, that have the fresh scars. But I've got points here from numerous counties, dozens of different sites, and I'm seeing these on all of them. So it's just a characteristic of Wyandotte chert. Here's another little kind of crude blade that I found, and you can see there's a lot of those fresh looking flakes on it. Here's a piece of another one. Again, you can see them. Here's a nice, like a big sandy or something like that, middle archaic, large side notch cluster, and it's got those on there. Here's another, just a really crude piece of a blade. This is obviously not something somebody would plant to try to fool anybody, and it looks like it was made yesterday. I mean, look at those. You can really see those fresh scars. These are all Wyandotte chert. Here's a tip off a point. Same thing. You can see lots of those. Now, one thing I'll also point out is that when people are making these videos, sometimes the camera picks up stuff that you can't see with the naked eye. But this was one that was in one of my videos. It's not up anymore. And here in real life, it just looks like a piece of Wyandotte chert, and there's a little bit of loose flakes on it. But when I made that video, I mean, this whole thing is just looks like it was made yesterday. It's covered with those little incompletely removed flakes that I can't see with the naked eye, but for some reason my camera is really good at picking those up. So when you're watching the videos of guys with Wyandotte chert, a lot of times you'll see those little flake scars that you really can't see with the naked eye. Most of these points are fossiliferous chert, Harrodsburg chert, and most of them don't have that. This one's Jeffersonville chert. No, that's irrelevant to a lot of you, but if you live in the area where that's found, you might find these chert types interesting. But having said that, here's a little Kirk point made of Harrodsburg. I'm going to bring it out here in the sun, and there is a flake that doesn't look completely removed on it. So while it's not common, and I don't know how well the camera's picking this up, but right there, that flake, it's the same thing as like what we're talking about. It's an incompletely removed flake, and it is a different color than the other. So it's uncommon on these fossiliferous chert types, but you could, I guess this proves you could have that. This was one I found in 1991. One that I believe is probably a Benton or Elk River. It's middle archaic in time period. And look, this thing is just covered with incompletely removed flakes. When did I find this one? 99, I found this one. In a field along a little creek, but look at that. Right there, there's a incompletely removed flake, and then this whole side is just covered with them. But that's a middle archaic point, and it looks, you know, I'd be really suspect somebody brought this to me. It looks like it was made yesterday, but I found it in the field, and I think you can tell by looking, there's no doubt it's a good one. And I mean, this was a pretty obscure place out in the field where I found it, so I'm 99% confident nobody planted that on me. But there's one example. Here's a table rock point, late archaic, similar to the bottleneck points, but a little bigger. And it doesn't have as many, but there's 1, 2, 3, you know, in the notches, you know, that looks like the fresh crushing that guys tell you to look out for, and you should look out for it. I'm not saying that's bad advice, but it's not the, you know, there are exceptions. Here's some more fresh flakes off of that. So there's the table rock point that demonstrates how it can have fresh looking flakes. This is a late archaic Karnak point, French lick phase. Probably about 5,000-year-old point, and you can see there's several flakes on there that look like they were made yesterday. This is a really nice Karnak. They're not usually made out of this high quality material, especially Wyandotte with a bullseye. But again, it's got several of those flakes that if I were to find this and post it on a video on YouTube, guys would be like, hey, that looks like it was made yesterday. Are you sure not planting that? And I'm sure there are guys out there planting them, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's some fake videos, but you know, don't be quite so quick to judge unless you really know the material and the area the guys are hunting, because you know, they could be real. This one looks like it's not that old, but it is. Here's a Rad-Ats or Big Sandy middle archaic point, and right there where I've written the date and all that stuff on there, all those flakes look brand new. In the notches, you see the crushing and the light coloration on that side. There's a bunch of those incompletely removed flakes on this side. So, you know, but it's obviously a no-brainer, good point. I found it myself out in the middle of the field. It's got the basal grinding, it's got all the flaking type. It's not a place that anybody else, I might have ever seen one other guy ever hunt there in my life. So, you know, no-brainer, authentic point, but it does have some of those fresh-looking flakes that if I found this and posted, somebody would be like, wait, what are all those hinges on there? And that's just the way Wyandotte Chert is. That's what this video is about. Hey, I'm going to look at a few more. Here's some kind of a terminal archaic or early woodland stemmed piece, and you can see it's got a whole bunch of those fresh-looking flake scars on it. There's a big one right there. They're all up and down the side. There's crushing on the edge. Other terminal archaic or early woodland piece, probably terminal archaic barbed, not a Buck Creek, but something similar. And this isn't Wyandotte Chert. I'm not sure what it is, but you can see this material, whatever it is like the Wyandotte. It has some very fresh looking scars on it. Here's some type of early archaic point. It's been damaged. It may have been a pine tree or a kirk, but you can see there's all kinds of, I mean, this looks like somebody just made it yesterday. I'd be really skeptical if somebody brought that to me or showed it to me, but I found that in December of 1990 on a site that I've never seen anybody else hunt, so I'm pretty sure that's authentic. But as you can see, lots of fresh scarring on there. Okay, another case of points and other artifacts, obviously like the slate pendant, and most of these are not Wyandotte Chert. And as you can see, most of these do not have any fresh looking flakes on them. These are mainly the Harrodsburg and Allen's Creek, and they very seldom, it's not impossible as we just saw, but they very seldom have fresh flakes on them. There's a piece of Stanford Chert, there's another piece of Jeffersonville heat treated, but none of these points have any of those fresh looking flakes except for some of the ones made out of Wyandotte or Hornstone. And that's why, like I said, that's why I'm doing this video, because it's a unique chert where these flake scars show up more than other ones. So here's I'm guessing this is a early woodland point, and maybe the camera's picking them up, but to the naked eye, this has, well, I see maybe one or two little bitty fresh looking scars, but not much at all. So not all points of Wyandotte Chert have those fresh scars, but many do. This one has hardly any, but I do see one or two now that I got it out in the sunlight. I never really looked at it this closely. Just for reference, here's a Kirk point, which is early archaic, same site, and different type of material. I'm not sure what it is, maybe a form of Indian Creek, but you don't see any of those fresh flake scars on there at all. Another point, same site, maybe one freshish looking scar, but otherwise none of that at all. So it didn't really show up on this one. Not sure of the point type on this one, but as you can see, there's not much of the fresh looking scars on it made a Wyandotte Chert from the same site as that last one. Now I'm going to show you a couple more from that site that have a few more scars. Here we have a heavy duty point, which is much older than the other ones I just showed you. This is early archaic, and it's got a lot of those fresh looking scars on it, but there's no doubt it's authentic. It's been beat up, and you can actually see the discoloration where there's a fresh break right there. See how the chert is darker on that edge than the rest of it? That's a fresh break. That incidentally is something when you're looking for fakes you want to look for. A lot of times there will be a point that's broken off and guys will rechip along the edge, and you can see the difference in the coloration. May not have those fresh looking flake scars like this, but you'll have the darker coloration where it has not weathered and patinated like the rest of the material, and that's a dead giveaway that maybe yeah, it is an authentically old point, but maybe this whole edge of it was recently reshaped by somebody. This one unfortunately was just damaged by the plow on the disc off the tip, but you can also see there are tons of these fresh flake scars on here. 5/29/98, I remember finding that. On to my next frame. These are all from around Leatherwood Creek, which is a creek that runs through my county. These are some of my finds off Leatherwood. And again, most of the chert types do not have any of the fresh looking scars except for the Wyandotte Chert. It's just a characteristic of it. Here's one that has a couple of them, but it looks like it's almost grading into Wyandotte. It might be a really crude variation of it. But most of these, here's some Indiana Green, Attica, there's some Indian Creek. Most of these do not have those fresh looking scars on them. There's some classic fossil earthers. There's a blade out of Burlington Chert. But anyway, I'm going to show you these points that are Wyandotte because it's interesting. Here's would have been a killer Lost Lake. Very well made out of Wyandotte. And look, they used the Cortex on that side. And look at that, it's got tons of those fresh looking flake scars on it, but this is a very, very old point. You know, ground base, just a classic Lost Lake, but it's got those flake scars on it. Other site, just a few ridges over from the bottoms where that was found, and here is a low flared base, or Baker's Creek, which is a terminal middle woodland point. much newer, more around the time of Christ instead of 9,000 years ago. And it's got not as many of those fresh flakes, but it still has, especially here. Look in the notches real carefully. See that crushing? Got that crushing, and it looks like it was recently made, but this was a construction site. This came from several feet down when they dug the foundation for a big luxury home that sits there now. And there's no doubt this one's real, but yeah, it's got the crushing in the notch. So that's not necessarily an indicator that it's not a good point. Next ridge over from that low point, they built a real luxury house here. This house there is now like 11,000 square feet with an elevator in it, and it's one of my favorite sites. I just hated it when they built that house on there and destroyed it, and thank God I saved a few points out of there. This is early archaic. I think it might be a form of a harden. It's got a ground base. It looks like maybe one of those short base harden, which is really rare around here, but it's either that or some Kirk variant. Anyway, it's early, whatever it is, and it's got just a few of those fresh looking flakes, but not nearly as many as the points that I just showed you. Okay, here is a Thebes point. I found this one on 3/12/99. I remember that. This was out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody had ever hunted this farm. The guy plowed it had been a cattle pasture, and he turned it. Old fella, real nice, and he let me look there, said nobody had ever hunted for arrowheads, and I wasn't expecting to find much. I walked out and this Thebes was laying there. But look at that, right here in this notch, you can see there's a flake. I could just pick that off of my fingernail. It looks like it was just made. You know, and here's a couple more of those. And a couple more. Thebes are early archaic. They're one of the older point types that you find here in the Midwest. So this is a very old point on a place that nobody's ever hunted arrowheads. So I mean, no brainer authentic, and just look at the way it's made and everything. And but it has, because it's Wyandotte Chert, it has some very fresh looking flake scars on it. So again, I guess that's the whole point of this video, is that Wyandotte Chert is different than a lot of cherts, and it will retain those flakes for thousands of years. I'm gonna look at a couple more points. This frame came from right down over that hill, actually right here off my own property, that I found over the years. But most of these, again, there's all different types of cherts, and most of them do not have those incompletely removed flakes on them, except for the ones out of Wyandotte Chert or Hornstone. Except here's one that's interesting. This is Holland Chert, which is basically Indiana's version of Flint Ridge. If I told somebody this was Flint Ridge, they would believe me, and they'd have no way of proving it wasn't. It comes out in Du Bois County, Indiana, down by a little town of Holland. There's other places, but that's the main source for it. But this stuff is identical to Flint Ridge. It's really high grade stuff. But if you look at this one closely, I can see several little flakes that are not completely removed, what the guys would call hinges on here, that look fresh. I found this back in the 90s. When was that? 92, 1492. Kirk corner notch made out of Wyandotte Chert. My dad found right down there in the mid 80s. And again, especially down along this edge, there's all kinds of fresh looking flakes on there, but this puppy's thousands of years old. Another little Kirk point my dad found down there in the 80s, and again, quite a few of those fresh looking flakes, Wyandotte Chert. Here's an Adena I found on the Clampett site in the 80s, and man, this thing is beautiful. One of my favorite points of all time. But if you look closely, it doesn't have very many of those fresh looking scars, but it looks like there's maybe one right there where my thumb is. Maybe the camera's picking up some more, but yeah, a little bit on the edge. So it does have a few of those fresh looking scars. This is an early woodland point, early woodland period. But one of my favorite points I ever found. Beautiful Adena, but it does have, being Wyandotte Chert, a few of those fresh scars. Another one, I found this about 150 yards from the Clampett site, same field, different site, 12LR 330 versus 329, which is Clampett site. Anyway, beautiful, another Adena, early woodland. You can see there's just a few of those fresh scars, but if you flip it over, you can see there's a lot more of them. See all these little scars right in here? That looks like it was made yesterday, but that's a absolutely authentic. Another one of my favorite points of all time. I found this in December of 92. Just a tiny bit of it was showing. I thought it was in a field that was no-till, and it was in corn stubble. I thought it was a piece of black plastic. I hit it with my stick and it flipped up in the air and I about fell over. This is a very old point, but and this one's Wyandotte. There's very little of the fresh flaking on there, but it's right at the end of my thumb, right above it there. You can see one fresh looking flake, but not much at all on this older point. I don't know if it's because of the age or just because of the soil conditions, but this is just another good example of Wyandotte Chert. Okay, a few more points here I'm going to show you. This one is Muldraw Chert. Not nearly as high grade as Wyandotte, but it's nice stuff. But this one actually has a flake that has been removed like that, but it doesn't show up like it does on the Wyandotte. I think that might explain a lot of it. Wyandotte is such a dark chert, being almost black or dark blue or gray, that whenever you get that light shining in, or like we talked about earlier, the analogy with the broken toenail, you can really see the difference in color, because when it separates and the light gets under there, you really see the contrast between the really dark chert and the area where the light's getting in. See, this piece of muldrow, that little flake, I could probably knock it off of my finger, but you can barely tell that it's been removed like that, because it's a lighter colored chert. I think that may be a lot of it. It's just the translucency. Somewhat of a thin piece of Wyandotte is fairly translucent, and then also the dark matrix, the dark background of the Wyandotte makes it really show when any light gets underneath the flake, and you can really differentiate the color. I think that might be this is kind of a way with a different chert to demonstrate that. I'm going to show you some more pieces. Nice early woodland Adena, but it's definitely a good piece. I found this recently. Early archaic Palmer point. But you can see there's a few of those fresh looking flakes, but this is an early archaic, very old point. Okay, here's another one, real high grade. I believe this is Derby chert. It could be Holland, but I think it's Derby. But you can see there are some of those fresh looking flakes on, and there's a lot on that side, and it looks a lot like the Wyandotte. You can really see where those fresh flakes are at. It seems to be a characteristic of the high grade cherts more than the low grade cherts, and again I think it's because of the translucency of the high grade cherts. And then if you take one, like if this was Wyandotte with a darker background, these would really show up. Okay, here's the point that kind of inspired this whole video. It's one the guy called me out on and wondered if it wasn't real. And I mean, yeah, again, somebody could have planted this on me. And you can see there's a few, what I'm seeing with the naked eye is a few of those fresh flakes here and there and a little on the edge. But this is one where the guy said, how come it's got fresh hinges? I don't hardly ever see that on the points I pick up. And well, if you're picking up certain types of chert, you will almost never see that, as you've seen. But if you're hunting sites with Hornstone, Wyandotte chert, you're going to see this on way more points than you're not going to see it. You're going to see some of these fresh flake scars probably on 95% of your points, and some of them are going to have quite a number of them. They're going to be covered with them. But it made me, and I appreciate that guy asking the question, because I thought, hey, maybe this is a fake. And I looked at it real closely and looked under not a microscope, magnifier, and it's a no-brainer. And then it got me looking at my other points. I was like, daggone, I thought that Wyandotte had a lot of these unremoved flakes, and by golly, I was right. There's just tons of these unremoved flakes that show up on Wyandotte points, regardless of whether it's a triangle point from 700 years ago or if it's a early archaic point from almost 10,000 years ago. And speaking of newer points, here's a Jack's Reef point. This is a true arrowhead. Most of what people are showing on these videos are not arrowheads, because the bow and arrow in this part of the country wasn't around until maybe 1,500 years ago or so. So the only true arrowheads you're going to find around here are pentagonal and triangular shaped points, or notched pentagonals like this happens to be. This is one of the earliest arrow points, but this is an arrow point. And you can see this is much newer than the other points I just showed, but it has a few of those fresh flake scars, but not more. You'd think being newer, it's had less time for them to wear off, and this would be covered with them, but it really doesn't have any more than a Lost Lake or Thebes or some of those early points that I showed. So you really, I don't think it really matters that much how old the point is. I thought maybe the older ones would have fewer of those flakes, but I don't think it really matters all that much. But most of the points that you're seeing are atlatl darts or knives. I think a big majority of them are knives. And spear points. I saw a guy the other day that got on somebody, and they said they found a spear point, and they said no, it's probably a knife because the atlatl was invented, and atlatl dart points are quite small. And that's true, but people use lances and spears all the way up, ceremonially. In dances they use spears, but then also, a spear is a formidable weapon if you're in close range with somebody. Yeah, for atlatl dart, you're going to have a point that's not more than a couple inches long, most likely. But you also, if a guy gets in 5 feet from you, that atlatl isn't going to do any good. He's going to shove it up your rear end, if you don't fight him off with something else. So you might want to have a lance with a big point on it. So yeah, they did have spear points all the way up until contact. But yeah, valid point is that most of the points that people find are not arrowheads. And most of the atlatl darts were quite small, so most of the things you're finding that are older, that are big, probably are knives, but they did have spear points. You can't say without a time machine this was a spear point or a knife, something big like that piece of muldrow that I just showed you. That was probably a knife, but it could have been on a spear, who knows. Same thing with Adena points. They were probably knives, but I'm sure some of them were tips of spears too. So yeah, most likely your atlatl points would be small, like the point I have the red one on the left there, and your knives would have been the larger pieces. That piece on the right, it's really too big to put on an atlatl dart. You can do it, but you'd have to be throwing it pretty closely. It wouldn't be the optimal type point. You'd want a much smaller point. But you know, and it was probably used as a knife, but who's to say that wasn't on a spear for when I have an animal wounded and I'm 2 feet away from it trying to dispatch it and finish it off, or some big guy's trying to beat me with a war club, and I want to stay 5 feet away from him because he's 6'2" and I'm 5'7" and he's got a big reach on me. So yeah, that was a valid point. I just want to point that out because I've seen that in several videos lately where people jumped all over somebody for saying they found a spear point, and they're saying, oh, it's a knife because they're using atlatls. And that's true. I agree 100%. And it probably was a knife. Knives are a lot more common probably than spear points, but you know, we don't know. I don't know. You don't know without going back in time whether it was a spear point or a knife. It was certainly not an atlatl dart point if it's, you know, 5 inches long, but it could have been a spear point just because the atlatl had largely replaced the spear. They still had them. All right, one last frame. This frame has a lot more Wyandotte pieces in it and a few other neat things like a pebble pendant, bone needle and stuff. There's some Wyandotte Chert, classic Wyandotte Chert. But I'm going to pull a couple of these out just so you can see on the Wyandotte. Some of them, like this one, was water worn. It's smooth over. There are no incompletely removed flakes on this one. They're just not on there on this dovetail, St. Charles point, which is a very old point. But then other points, this is some kind of an early woodland piece. And you can see here in the light, there's tons of not completely removed flakes on it. Here's a Snyder's point, Wyandotte Chert, and there's just a few right here in the notch. You can see the crushing, and you can see a few of those incompletely removed flakes. This is not an incompletely removed flake. This is just a differentiation in the color of the Wyandotte Chert, just a light spot in it. But this is an incompletely removed flake. This is another inclusion in the material where it's just a lighter spot. Some people might say this was Sonora because of the different inclusions in it, but there's, you know, they kind of blend together. And there's another not completely removed flakes, and again in the notches, a little bit of crushing. So authentic middle woodland Hopewellian and Snyder's point, but it does have some fresh looking flakes on it. Then we have this big knife that is made out of some other type of material inferior to Wyandotte, even though they still worked it down really nicely. But as you can see, because of the buff material and the grainier material, there are none of those incompletely removed flakes, at least none that we can see showing up on this one. It's important to know your chert type before you make a conclusion based on those so-called hinges. I'm back inside and just show these are, I pulled all the broken materials from the sites that have a lot of Wyandotte Chert on them that I've hunted in the last year and a half. I've examined all these different pieces, and as you can see, probably 90% Wyandotte Chert here laid out on the table. I've got blades, I've got scrapers, I've got midsections, I've got bases, diagnostic points, indistinguishable points, just a little bit of everything from all different time periods. And in looking at them, it was about like the points I just showed you. I'd say 80–90% of the Wyandotte points have at least a couple of those fresh looking scars on them, regardless of what time period they come from. And some of them have almost none of them, and some of them have a whole bunch of them on there. It looks like somebody just made them yesterday.